Hello and welcome to the Indian Express. As many of you know, today the government presented the economic survey for the last financial year, which ended in March. And tomorrow the government will present the next budget, which is the budget for the current financial year. In February, the government had presented an interim budget, and tomorrow would be the full-fledged version, because now we have a new government, a new constituents within the government. So it will be sort of an update of the interim budget. But today what we have is the economic survey that was presented, and the economic survey is typically the official look back on the state of the economy, and it makes a very interesting reading. The economic survey, it has many observations about the state of the economy, and looking at economic surveys in the past, the tone and tenor and the details mentioned in the economic survey are quite remarkable, because typically we've seen that in the last few years the economic surveys have tended to sort of present a far more optimistic picture of the economy. But this economic survey, which is sort of the first one that is being presented under the new government, makes for a much more somber reading. There is a much greater realization of the challenges facing the Indian economy. So let me just quickly brief you a bit about what the economic survey is trying to say. The first thing is that the economic survey is saying that it expects that based on the growth that we had in the past financial year, in the current financial year, Indian economy is likely to grow at around 6.5 to 7%. 6.5 is the base case scenario, 7% is what they think that if things go right, will touch that level. And that's not a meager achievement in that sense, because we have grown quite rapidly out of the COVID distress. When we actually hit a recession, the economy had contracted by around 6%, and since then we have grown at 9% and then another 8 or 7% since then. But the economic survey stands out for sort of delineating some of the major challenges facing the economy. So while there are many good things in the overall sense in terms of growth rates, there are substantive challenges facing the economy. One of the first challenges is sort of the challenge that comes from a global scenario. As you understand that if the global economy is not doing very well, or if other countries tend to hold back trade and are protectionist, as we have seen in many countries like the US, where or even in many countries in Europe, where countries are increasingly looking inwards and wanting to protect their own domestic businesses, trade becomes stops being an engine of growth, as it were, and starts becoming a sort of a risk. And the economic survey points out that the global scenario is becoming more and more difficult, partly because of the fact that many of the countries are looking in a protectionist manner towards trade, but also because of geopolitical tensions. The survey notes that the relative peace that was there over the last 8 decades is sort of under question in the coming years, and that is likely to have its say in the matter. Many of the economies globally are trying to use industrial policy to promote their own industries and their own domestic firms, and in such a scenario, for India to sort of gain market share in its export markets, it would be tougher. Also adds to this the problem of high interest rates across the world, which makes it difficult to sort of break this cycle. The second thing that the economic survey sort of talks about is the fact that is the issue of jobs. Now there are multiple angles from which the economic survey has sort of tackled this issue, but the first thing that they've said is that the Indian economy faced two main shocks. One was the what was called the twin balance sheet problem, that in the first term of the Modi government there was a lot of talk about how banks were laden with a lot of NPAs, and the corporate sector, corporate firms were stuck with a lot of over leveraged. They had taken too many loans and they were stuck, and so neither party was really playing its part in increasing India's growth. And the second was the COVID pandemic shock, and also the inflationary shock that came. And the economic survey blames these two shocks as the reason why India's employment has not sort of grown as much as one would want. But within that, it's quite remarkable that the economic survey has very clearly said that there is a lack of data. As this is something that a lot of people outside the government have been saying for a very long time, that jobs data or data on employment has been an issue. And just reading from the note that the chief economic advisor has written, he says that the lack of availability of timely data on the absolute number of formal and informal jobs created even at annual intervals, even at an annual level, that kind of data availability, lack of that data availability precludes an objective analysis of the labor market or the labor situation in the country. So it's a very honest admission that there is a problem with timely and good quality data on employment. The numbers per se are fairly weak, given the fact that we look at data from, say, factories jobs over 8 years. The data mentioned factories jobs within factories grew by 12 lakhs only, and over the roughly the same period the informal jobs actually fell by 13 lakhs. So one thing is growing by 12 lakhs and the other is coming down by 13 lakhs, and these numbers are very small compared to what is required even by the economic survey. Its own estimate, around 80 lakh jobs or 8 million jobs annually are required for India over the coming decade to sort of satisfy the demographic dividend we are witnessing in the economy. And therein they've also mentioned a couple of challenges within that. One is the China challenge, that China is still dominating the low skills manufacturing. It has not relinquished that space, and so for India it is difficult to sort of gain that space, and also the fact that India is overly dependent on China for many of the imports, in particular also on, say, renewable energy. So that also adds to the jobs problem. But the other thing on jobs that the economic survey has said is about the role of the private sector. It notes that the private sector has had a lot of the corporate sector. It says that in terms of financial performance, the corporate sector has never had it so good. So basically the government is saying that the corporate sector, the private sector is really doing well, but it also notes that the effect on hiring or compensation, that is what the private firms pay to their people and how many people they employ, that number has not grown. So the profits might have gone up in the last 3-4 years by 4 times, but the number of people employed and the compensation that you give them has not even doubled. So the government has pointed that out as a reason why employment is low and why maybe overall demand is low, and has tried to make a case that the private sector should be doing more. It's talked about the fact that the private sector, if it doesn't do more on the jobs front by giving more jobs and by increasing incomes, then it will come back and boomerang on them because the demand will be lower. As the chief economic advisor said, that if people do not have money, they won't be buying the cars that you are producing, that kind of an argument. The economic survey also talks about the threat of AI, artificial intelligence, on India's jobs. It notes that there are many research papers that are showing that India's services jobs might be affected, which is something that has been growing fast, and even that might be affected because of AI. And there again it passes on the responsibility on the private sector, saying that it's the responsibility of the private sector to ensure that they keep employing people, that workers are employed, and that they don't just typically replace people with machinery or programs for their own benefit. Many might think that this is a rather it's wishful thinking, that private sector would perhaps do anything which is anything other than the private a profit motive, but at least that is what the economic survey is asking the private sector to do. Similarly, it has talked about not having excessive profits and taking a responsibility in creating more jobs, and it has talked about something called the tripartite compact, a compact between the governments, the private sector, and the academia. And by government they mean both the center and states. So it's sort of the economic survey is sort of trying to include every other sector in to provide a solution, and actually ask more of the private sector to provide a solution, because that's been the larger perspective that this government has followed over the last 5-10 years, where it has said that the government is not in the business of creating jobs. Government is in the business of making it easy for you to do business, and then the businesses do well, they'll create more jobs. So that's another thing that the economic survey has talked about. It calls the subhead for that is that the real corporate social responsibility that the private sector has. And there it talks about even things like for banks to ensure that there are not too many NPAs, for firms to ensure that they do not missell investment instruments. There's a lot of fear that are too many Indians investing too much, and is that in the stock market or in market instruments which may not be necessarily terribly safe, and so it has again asked of the corporate sector to sort of take care of that and look at both employment generation and income growth. It has also asked of the corporate sector to sort of go back to promoting traditional Indian lifestyle, because it's quite remarkable that the economic surveys said that social media and lifestyle of India's youth is sort of diminishing its economic potential, reducing its productivity. It says social media, screen time, sedentary habits, unhealthy food are a lethal mix that can undermine public health and productivity and diminish India's economic potential. So that's another, I don't think I've ever read something like this in an economic survey where they've sort of talked about what the private sector has to do. So from everything from protecting to AI, from AI to giving more jobs to earning lesser profits to lifestyle changes, a lot has been parked on the private sector. For the government's part, there are a few things that the economic survey has noted for the future. It has said that there is no reason why India should look at agriculture as something from which people should just be saved, and that this is a bad sector for growth. In fact, they have asked a question saying that can farm sector be India's savior? So sort of looking at the issues on increasing farm productivity, agriculture yields, and I think this might go back to the larger question of the farm laws that the Modi government had brought in the second term and then had to repeal because it somehow could not convince enough people about about the wisdom behind the farm laws. And I think there is a certain element here that we need to change our farming. Some of the things that were mentioned were that there should be land consolidation and there should be better yields to achieve that goal. The other thing that they've asked, it has suggested that the government can do is to unleash the small industries, the small enterprises, the MSMEs that we know. And one of the things that it has talked about there is to reduce the regulatory bottlenecks that many of the small firms face. And so that is where the chief economic advisor was very clear that I don't think we should be thinking in terms of big reforms, big bang reforms as they are often referred to, but saying that a lot of the work now is the grunt work, the details, getting the things done. So in that sense, it appeared as if that small tweaks in rules and regulations and the actual functioning of how smaller firms, smaller enterprises function in the country, that needs to be improved. And it has also talked about energy transition, wanting for India to sort of shift to a more renewable energies regime. But it has also noted that there are budget constraints, in terms of the subsidies that the government can give, and also as you move away from fossil fuels typically give you a lot of income, give governments a lot of revenues. So as you move away from that revenue would also get hit. So that element is also there. So overall, it's a sobering read on the economy. There are a lot of challenges facing the Indian economy. They expect something around 6.5 to 7% in the coming year, in the current year, and possibly in the medium term. But there are, as they say, there are skills gap, there are education gaps, and there are lifestyle challenges, regulatory challenges for the small enterprises, and the global scenario is also getting tough because of the geopolitics, the high interest rates, and the China angle being so close, and how they dominate many of the manufacturing bits that we want to, India wants to sort of take over. So yeah, that's a very broad summary of the economic survey. Let's see if there are any queries on what I've just, the summary that I've given. Okay, I think I think Prime Minister Modi has tweeted, the economic survey highlights the prevailing strengths of our economy and also showcases the outcomes of the various reforms our government has brought. It also identifies areas for further growth and progress as we move towards building a Viksit Bharat. So yeah, I think there is, as things stand, there is a certain element of continuity, but I think, as I said, there's much greater recognition this time around in the economic survey of the kind of challenges that are there, including something as basic as a data challenge, that we do not know as much about our job situation. And I think one of the issues that will perhaps dominate, and we'll have the budget tomorrow and perhaps a lot of discussion on it depending on what the budget says, is that the government, this government has since 2014 had a very clear view, and this is a conservative view, and conservative governments across the world tend to have this kind of a view where they say that there should be a small government. And so smaller governments tend to then believe that they should move out of the economy and the private sector should take part. And to that end, in 2019, this government gave a massive tax break. Corporate tax was reduced. It was a historic cut. And something close to 1.5 lakh crores was sort of, was the kind of money that was foregone. And the hope that this government had was that corporates would take this 1.5 lakh crores and sort of invest in the economy. That investment, fresh investment, would create jobs and there'll be broader prosperity. But as the economic survey has noted and the finance minister has noted numerous times, that element hasn't really happened. The private sector hasn't really invested much. That is not to say that the stock market has not done well or the private profits have not gone up. Actually, India's profits, the profitability of India's corporate sector has gone up exactly at the time when the economy tanked. and that is primarily because many of these firms did get a lot of tax benefit from the government, and so their profits went up. Everybody wanted to buy their shares, and the share prices went up, and stock market soars. So there are issues with the broader strategy that the government has followed, and the economic survey notes that we are hoping that the private sector would now come into play. It almost appears as if the government doesn't have too much more to do apart from making some tinkering on the regulatory side, but overall they expect the private sector to now step in and really play its part, deliver on the logic that when the government moves out and invests in the same time in terms of infrastructure, there will be more incentive for the private sector to come in and create more opportunity. The flip side of this argument is that in 2019, many of the viewers might recall that in 2019, India's economy grew by less than 4%. And right through 2019, which was the first year of that government's term, there were news items talking about how consumption was slowing. India's growth rate had been falling since 2017-18 onwards, and there were growing concerns that consumption is sort of is losing steam. And at that time, the government could have either flipped and given consumption a boost, or could have given production a boost. This government decided to give production a boost, give the private sector a boost, the companies a boost, but those companies haven't responded, and they haven't responded because their argument is that we'll put in the money only when there's demand for our products. So you'll see that the places where there is demand because of the K-shaped recovery, those elements, those sections of the economy which have actually done well, and there is demand, say for costlier cars, say a car worth 20 lakhs or more, those around that price band are getting sold more, and there are fewer scooters being sold and fewer cars of 3 lakhs or 4 lakhs or 5 lakhs being sold. And what explains that? That large part of that part of the economy which was willing to buy a 3-4 lakh car is struggling, but that part of the economy which was capable of buying a 20 lakh car is actually doing well. And associated products, you can think of what all a person who's buying a 25 lakh or 30 lakh car might be eating or wearing, or so those associated products are selling more, and that's essentially the problem here, that the government has in its mind done everything possible to incentivize the private sector. The private sector thinks that we're not seeing as much demand on the ground for us to put in a lot more fresh capacity, and this economy is in a bit of a bind in that sense. And the global scenario is not such that massive export demand or global trade pulls up the overall growth. So that's the situation for the economy. I don't think we have any questions as such, but let me just brief you a bit about the budget also. Tomorrow is the union budget, full budget for the current financial year. An interim budget was presented in February, and a couple of things that would be worthy of looking is, one is the overall strategy. In 2019, the government had made this massive bold move on the investment strategy. It would be worth looking at the fact whether it wants to reconsider that strategy and do something to boost consumption. So that's one big issue. Typically, consumption can be boosted either by giving a tax break or by spending more. The government can actually spend more or give more money either directly or through some works, and so that the money reaches in the hands of the people, or it could tax less. But the mandate in terms of taxation was also limited now in the budget, because the indirect tax, the GST, is outside the budget. GST is actually something that affects all of us far more because it's a much broader tax. So since GST is unlikely to be met with in the budget. One could perhaps be keeping an eye out on what happens on the income tax front. The other thing is spending, how the government wants to spend its money, whether it's in creating more jobs or giving more subsidies, and if it gives more subsidies, then what happens to its overall borrowings, because the government doesn't have unlimited budget, so there's always this gap between what it earns and what it spends. So that's one thing. The other thing is that from the interim budget, we all remember that the interim budget had one of the key things that all of us understood from the interim budget was that the interim budget did not show any betray any sense that it was a budget just before the election. So it was a non-political budget, as it were. There was no politics as such in it. A lot of people thought that it sort of gave an impression that the government was sure, the Prime Minister was sure that he's going to come back with the resounding majority. But that hasn't happened. The election saw BJP lose its majority status in the House. Its overall seats were cut down by 20%, 1/5 seats were lost. And so today with 240 seats, whether the new budget, a revision of the interim budget, will that show the politics of it? Will we see some measures which try to address the reasons why BJP might have lost? Keep an eye out on news about say Uttar Pradesh, where BJP lost a lot of seats. Maharashtra is another state where assembly election is due. Haryana is another state. So keep an eye out on those issues. There can be concerns about what does the government do in terms of the job strategy. Is it going to just talk that the private sector now has to step in, as the economic survey is doing, or is it going to actively go and do something about it, and what is that strategy? And if it adopts that strategy, is it going to go back on its earlier strategy of saying that we are a small government and the private sector will take the lead? So those are the issues that will be worth noticing. There's also been a couple of things. One, we've seen a lot of news about railways, rail accidents. So maybe there is something on those lines worth watching out, whether there's something happening there. And similarly, there's a lot of talk about how Indians are investing increasingly, a lot of futures and options trading, households getting into that, and there's a lot of concern that is it too much, and are people realizing cognizant of the risks that are there? So does the government do anything about that? Increase the capital, the tenure where it applies the capital gains tax or long-term capital gains tax or something like that. But anyway, all of this is right now in the realm of speculation. We'll see it tomorrow at 11 a.m. when the finance minister gets up to present the first budget of this government, and we'll keep you updated for that.